All right. So good evening, Fighting Scots. I'm Jordan Sherpy-Lencioni, the Associate Director of Alumni Engagement for the college. I wanted to welcome everybody to our event tonight titled Getting Started with Oil Painting with Monmouth's very own Professor Brian Baugh. We're very thrilled that everyone is here to join us tonight. Before we begin, I just wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's event will be recorded and available on the Monmouth College website within the next week. For your best viewing experience during Professor Baugh's presentation, make sure you're in the speaker mode. We'll have a couple of different cameras on him to see his supplies, but also to see him speak throughout this event. If you have any questions or you want to just give a shout out, feel free to put that in the chat. As Professor Baugh mentioned, we will allow folks to turn their cameras on and their audio on at the end of the event, so that if you've got any questions you want to directly ask him, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, anything in the chat I will read aloud so that he can answer those questions. At the end of today's event, a short 3-minute survey will pop up in your screen, so please feel free to fill that out. It just has some questions asking about your feedback on the event and also your suggestions for our future events that we hold. A little bit about our presenter today. Professor Brian Baugh is both professor and chair to the art department here at Monmouth College. He has lived in Monmouth for more than 15 years with his wife, Stephanie, who is actually going to be assisting him today as his camera person. Brian is a painter, and his current work is focused on the freedom and energy of abstract painting. His teaching at Monmouth includes painting, drawing, printmaking, photography, graphic design, contemporary art, and art history. He's also led study abroad trips and taught semesters in Australia, Scotland, and Florence, Italy, as well as workshops through the Sophia Summer Research Program. Professor Baugh, the floor is yours.
All right, hello everybody. Again, I can't see you, but if you add questions into the chat, she'll catch them and send them on to me. In planning this, I was told to plan to speak for about 35 minutes, something like that. So I am going to try to keep it to that so that we can have questions at the end, because I think for me, that'll be the chance where I can actually see your faces and everything. This can be a little bit more interactive. So expect this to be about 35 minutes long. I've got my clock right across the way so I can see it, so I don't go way over. One of my least favorite things in going to presentations and people's talks is when they go about 20 minutes over and I just want to pull my hair out because I planned for a certain thing and then they're driving me nuts by going way long. And then there's no time for questions and stuff. So I'm going to really try to stay within that. Also remember that it is recorded. So I'm going to be showing different art supplies and things like that. So you should be able to pause that. I think that'll probably be a YouTube video, so you'll be able to pause that and be able to look at, what it is. Or if you want to get my email address, it's bbaugh@monmouthcollege.edu. You can email me and I can send you a list of supplies. And I can actually follow up, answer any follow-up questions if you like. And just like everybody, I'm stuck indoors more than usual because it's winter and there's a plague going on out there. So if anybody wanted to do a Zoom conversation with me, I'd be more than happy to talk to you because got more time on my hands than usual, I would say. So you can always get some follow-up from me. What else? The way that I'm gonna do this, I've got a technical thing I need to do real quick. I'm gonna do this is right now I'm just working from my laptop, but I'm gonna switch to filming this with my iPad. And so just need to set that up real quick. Screen mirroring. And all right, so there we go. So now you guys should be seeing a different view. You can probably see a little window of me over there talking to. So basically, I've just got my computer set up here, and that's my source of audio. So you might hear me pulling. I'm gonna hand that over to Stephanie. She's gonna point that at me. And so anyway, so I'm gonna try to make sure I stay fairly close to my laptop because I don't have a lapel mic, and that's where the mic is. I'm also gonna try to remember to talk toward where the sound is. So I'm gonna try not to talk back to you like that. If I do, Stephanie's told me she's gonna yell at me. So she'll try to keep me straight. All right, so my point of this talk today is in trying to figure out what to do with 35 minutes with you guys. I thought, we're in the middle of a plague and, we're looking for things to do. And some of you might be looking for a new hobby to try out, something to do in your spare time. And painting is a great thing for that because you get to sort of revel in color. You get to create something new. You get to make something. And so I thought I would focus on that. But then there's also some people here. I know Dusty Scott and Pat Messenger in particular, both accomplished painters, and they're here. And I'm hoping you guys get something out of it too. I know that I enjoy watching YouTube videos of painters and sort of seeing what paint they use, what brushes they use, and what little tips and pointers I can pick up just from their supplies and so forth, you know. So that's always fun for me to see other people's studios. So my focus on this is how to set up with a minimal amount of art supplies, with a minimal amount of expense, how can you get yourself set up to paint? And so my focus is going to be not on maximizing and getting the most colors and the most brushes and the best and all that. But if you're thinking about starting out and you're not sure you really want to take this on forever, you know, you can buy, you know, 4 tubes of paint, a couple of brushes, a few other little things, and you're good to go. And then if you later decide you don't like that hobby very much, you know, it didn't cost you very much, right? The other thing is, if you paint in a studio that is not in your own home, like a lot of professional artists will have a studio that is in a warehouse with other artists and they have professional ventilation. And so they don't have to worry about fumes. If you know anything about oil paint, painters often use turpentine or mineral spirits to thin the paint down. And if you know anything about those solvents, they're kind of not great for you, especially in a small enclosed space. And so my studio is actually in my home. This is just a bedroom that I converted into a studio, and it's right next to the bedroom I sleep in. And so I really don't want to use turpentine in here and make the house stink, right? So if you're setting up a studio in the corner of your dining room, you know, you probably also don't want the room to smell like a warehouse, you know. So that's the focus of this. And so what I'm going to talk through, basically, my outline is I'm going to talk first a little bit about why you might want to paint and what you might choose to paint, right? So if you're new to this hobby, you know, what might you start with? So I'm going to throw a few little ideas at you there. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Then I'm going to talk to you about supports, meaning what you paint on, canvas, wood panels, and so forth, and what to buy. You know, what's a good thing to start with. Easel recommendations, lighting, and then paint. You know, should you choose oil or acrylic paint? You know, what fits with your needs, and what brands to choose. Colors, what's a good palette to work with. And, you know, because I teach painting and I provide the paint to the students now, I have to be really budget conscious. And so, like, I've sort of figured out the least amount of colors we need to get the maximum amount of mixing power out of it, which is actually makes you a better painter anyway, right? If you're always having to like look for a certain color, like an esoteric variation of purple, you know, that's going to slow you down versus if you know how to use a particular red and a blue to make a purple and then modify that with, say, just a touch of yellow or a touch of whatever, you know, you're going to be a better painter for that anyway. So these are economical decisions, but they're actually the way I work. I don't actually paint in a different way than I teach my students. It's pretty economical, and I'm a cheapskate, so it fits my personality. Yeah, so
Professor Baugh?
Yes, that was loud, sorry.
Let me interrupt you for just a second. One of our attendees said that the iPad view is a little glitchy on their end. That we see on the right-hand side of the screen, it says video photo square. If you switch it to the video, will that maybe make it a little smoother? Let's try it.
I have switched it. We will see.
Okay, we'll keep you tuned.
Okay, yeah, just let me know if it's not working well, and I can actually just switch back to the laptop and pick it up and move it around too, you know, so that's either way works. All right, so the next thing is that I want to talk about. It's a little odd not seeing all your faces and teaching not to a classroom, because I've been teaching in a classroom for, you know, going on 20 years. I started teaching in 1999, actually over 20 years, but I'm still getting used to teaching by doing what actually feels like standing in the room talking to yourself. So it's a little odd, but I'll get used to it. So what to paint? So painting from observation. I'm going to draw right here. And so this is one of the paintings I've been working on lately, and I'll try to hold this still. And so as you can see, I've got my still life set up over on the left, and then you can see the painting I'm working on the right. And the still life setup itself is pretty simple, you know, shoebox. I've got a sculpture stand with some stuff set up on it. Colored backdrop, which is just a piece of pastel paper. And then the lighting. I don't know if you guys can hear me. I'm trying to sort of speak to the thing. And then here's the painting. Painting is in progress. It's not quite finished. The coffee pot thing is not done.
It's
So it's a
still,
work in progress. And
it's still a little glitchy, but it's focusing good on the painting. Is the
Okay.
feedback I'm getting.
is it just when I'm moving when it's kind of screwy?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. It'd probably do that anyway if it was the laptop or the thing. But yeah, and so I've got a smaller version too. So oftentimes it takes a while to do. We do this. Oftentimes I'll have the same still life set up for a while and I end up doing variations on it. So this is a little tiny version. It's about 10 inches tall. It then includes the shoebox part of it. So I just really like working from observation, and I can highly recommend doing it. These are fairly tight, realistic paintings, but I've also will work in a much faster style. So these are a couple. Anyway, these are a couple of paintings that are done much quicker, like the irises. If you know anything about cut irises, they sort of melt after a few hours. They don't really hold up very well. So that was done in the amount of time it took for the flowers to start wilting. So 4 or 5 hours in the painting on the left. And then the juggling balls was just a really quick kind of fun painting. So, and that's done in a much rougher, looser, faster style. It was just kind of a lot of fun to do. Another thing I'm dealing with, is that I think also do abstraction. I'll show you a couple of those paintings in just a minute and talk about that. But another thing I'm dealing with is just is that I unfortunately injured my shoulder pretty bad last year, and it's been over a year now, and it's not recovered. So, and that's my painting arm. I can still use it and move it around, but it just like becomes on fire after a while of painting. And so I'm learning how to paint left-handed. So, so I've been doing a lot of painting left-handed and drawing left-handed. So this is a looser sort of study, and it's really just for practice. So this is kind of a good example for if you're just starting out. When you're just starting out drawing from observation, painting from observation, you really have to get your brain to tell your hand what to do, right? And so it's really good practice to work from objects. And so it's kind of a skills building thing to work from life, and it's really satisfying to do. I really enjoy doing it. But yeah, so I've been working lefty quite a lot lately, and if you're a right-handed person, and you've ever tried to write your name with your left hand, you know how awkward that is, right? So so it's a similar thing. But if you've got some physical difficulties to overcome, bad back or whatever, things that make things hard, just remember that there's always going to be ways to modify. So it may be that, like, I always like to work standing. Like my workstation is always work standing. So this is basically where I paint all the time. And I don't keep a chair around here. It's really but over time, as my hips start to hurt more and whatnot, I'll probably start, painting seated. But I like the movement range you have when you paint standing. But there are some painters who like to work just flat on a table or even on the floor if they're working really big. If you're Dusty Scott, who's in the audience, you like to work on the side of buildings and work 10 feet tall and need scaffolds, I guess, to paint. So anyway, so yeah, just something to think about is and I'm going to talk more about materials too, and like what might be better for you to use. And so, maybe that if you have some physical problems, watercolor. I know when I first hurt my shoulder, I ended up just sitting at the table doing watercolors more often because I'm the kind of person who likes to always be making stuff and doing things. And to give my shoulder, when I was doing physical therapy and stuff, time to heal, I tried just, sort of sitting around and drawing that way. You're signaling something? What is that?
Just the camera's over here.
Oh, sorry. Okay, she's letting me know the camera's there. So. All right, so moving on, painting from photos is great too. Generally with students, I recommend they start out by working from direct observation just because it's really good practice. But you may want to paint things that you can't paint from direct observation, you know, pet portraiture is kind of a popular thing. You know, people like paintings of their pets. And if you want to, if you've ever tried to get a dog to sit still, you know, I mean, you know, you might need to work from a photo on that. Or if you're painting historical figures, like Dusty does, you know, you probably can't get Jackson Pollock to come back from the dead to sit for a portrait. So, you know, so it's natural and normal to do that. But yeah, so working from photos is also great for ephemeral effects like sunsets. You know, sunset's only going to last for so long. So that's kind of hard to work from observation. But another advantage of working from observation, I know like Fred Wackerly is an example. He's a trustee. You guys, some of you who graduated, I know I saw some people here graduating in the 60s and 70s and 50s. So if anybody knows Fred Wackerly, he became an outdoor painter, a plein air painter. And so he has like a special paint box for painting outdoors. And, you know, some people who fish, I used to fish when I was growing up, and a lot of, you know, people hung out with doing that. It was just as much about sitting outdoors and having an excuse to be outdoors as it was about catching the fish, you know? So, so it's another really good outdoor activity to do. Abstraction's a lot of fun, and that was really helpful for me when I was painting left-handed, you know, is working abstractly. It's not quite as strict, you know, like when I'm painting, like on this painting here, you know, I really end up using, I'm working so detailed, I'm using my smallest brushes, and I'm using what's called a mall stick. This is just a piece of bamboo with some paper towel tape to the end of it to affect the canvas. Then I'm working up really close on some of these small detailed areas. But with the abstraction, like this is one of the abstract paintings that I'm working on lately. You know, I can do the entire thing pretty much left-handed, you know, so that's been a lot of fun for me. And, you know, so there's a lot of options when it comes to painting in terms of various things you can do and try out, you know, so I encourage you to explore. All right, so the nitty gritty of what you need to start painting. Supports. So you gotta have something to paint on. So this is a very small painting. And sometimes for small detailed paintings, I think wood panels are really good. So this is just a simple piece of plywood with a 1x2 to frame it with, glued down, and then you gesso the surface. I'll explain what gesso is in a minute. And then with small brushes, you can get in and get really tight and detailed with that. So wood panels work great for detailed stuff. And then this painting is on canvas. And so you can get closer, you can sort of see the canvas weave. And so that gives kind of an interesting texture to paint on. This is what the back of it looks like. So canvas is an option. It just depends on what you want to do for your own work. So obviously you can purchase things pre-made. So this is a pre-made panel. So this is just 1x2s and plywood. And I don't have an example of pre-made canvas here still in this stuff, but I'm sure you've seen it at craft stores like Michael's. Quality matters, you know, it can be really tempting to buy the canvases that are $3. And there's like, you know, 3 in a pack and it's $6 or something like that. That seems like a good deal, but usually when you buy those and you unwrap them, they are, the panels that the wood it's made out of is warped, you know, it's like more shaped like a potato chip than flat. And sometimes the canvas is so wavy, like you want it to be nice and tight and not like sort of waving about. And so a lot of times when you buy the cheaper canvases, they'll be really kind of wavy and not great. So spending a little bit more, like getting the Blick is usually the brand I use because the store is located nearby. But the Blick Premier brand is really good and generally doesn't let me down in terms of that. Some of their other things, I know Pat Messenger works at Blick and he's on this this thing. Some of the stuff Blick sells is really just crap. I mean, it's called Blick Studio, I think is one of them, and it's just not very good. Sorry, Pat. Anyway, it's just usually like terrible. So, but you know, it's worth trying out different brands for yourself to see. What I really like to do is to make my own. And when you make your own, you're just much more in control of the final product. It takes more time, but if you're a person who's handy or you have a person who lives in your house that's handy and has woodworking supplies and stuff, it doesn't take much to do it. It doesn't take too much time. And then, you know, you've got a thing that you made yourself. So for example, to make your own panel, you just need like a 1x2. This is just a little 4 foot by 1x2 piece of pine. So really inexpensive, like a $2 piece of wood from Lowe's. So you need to measure out, you know, for the size that you're going to make. And you can get more customized sizes. You know, maybe you have some oddball size you want to make for a painting. maybe a really long skinny landscape or something, you know, then you can make custom sizes. So you just take these and then cut them down to size, put, you know, 45-degree angles on the wood, make, you know, all four sides as needed. And then I've not pre-made this to fit or anything. I just grabbed a few scraps out of my basement. But you know, you just glue these down. And you would do, you know, the other three sides as well. And then take some clamps, get that clamped in place with some wood glue, let that dry, sand the rough edges down. And then after you're done with that, you can't really paint just on the plywood surface. You'll need to put what's called gesso on it. So you have to seal the surface, basically so the paint doesn't just soak into the wood. The oil paint is made, if you're using acrylic paint, you could just paint directly on this. It would be a rough surface, but no worries. But with oil paint, the binder is oil, like linseed oil or safflower oil, with a dry powdered pigment suspended, you know, and they sort of grind it on these rollers. And so whether you're working on canvas or wood, you have to put a gesso surface down on it. Otherwise, the oil sort of sucks out and it leaves a really dry, crusty surface. And in addition to that, especially on canvas, I'll show you this part. Scooch in. So with canvas, you can work on just regular cotton duck, which looks like this. It's kind of a white. It's something you can buy at Giant Fabrics or any sort of basic, simple fabric store. Or if you want to go a little higher quality, you could use linen. So this is a roll of prepared linen. And anyway, the linen is a lot more expensive than the cotton. But if you're a portrait painter, or if you're a professional painter, or if you just want a nicer surface to work on, it has a more kind of naturalistic tooth to it. You can use that. It's a bit stronger and longer lasting too in terms of its archival qualities. Anyway, you can use, but anyway, when working on this, you have to use some sort of gesso. So this is a pretty good brand. It has really good coverage. And what this does is it seals the wood or the canvas surface and keeps the oil from leaching out into it. It also, oil is acidic. It sort of will eat away at stuff. So the best way, simplest way I can explain that is paper can either have an acid content to it or can be neutral. So you probably noticed if you've shopped for art supplies before that paper will say acid-free on the sketchbook, you know, and that's important because if it's not, if it's got acid in it, it'll start to turn brown and crumble over time, right? So if you've ever, you know, if you own books, obviously you've seen this, right? So if you've got like a cheap paperback, after about 10, 15, 20, 30 years, it's a brown, brittle thing, you know? And I've been actually surprised because, you know, what makes you feel old, like I'm 46 now, which isn't that old, but it's, you know, old enough, is I have books that are new to me, like that I bought like 20 years ago, and I open it up and I'm like, oh, it's turned brown. It's like, I just remember buying this like it was yesterday, you know? Or if you've seen a newspaper that you've left out in the sun, that turns brown and brittle and falls apart, that's because there's acid content in the newspaper, in that paper. And so the acid that's in the linseed oil, and it's not an acid that burns your skin, obviously, it will slowly over time eat away and disintegrate the canvas and cause problems for it later, archivally speaking. So that's the point of the gesso though. And if you don't use it, it's just, it would be like painting on a paper towel or something. It would be way too absorbent. So you have to use a gesso. And by doing it yourself, you can do creative things like use clear gesso. So for example, if you're using the linen to paint on, you can put this clear gesso on it and that brown linen stays brown instead of turning it white from the white in the acrylic gesso. And it looks a little bit more antique and old fashioned. So it's kind of a neat trick. And for stretching canvas, so you could stretch the canvas just over a wooden panel. Like it's really easy to make a panel. Or you can also buy these stretcher strips pre-made. And they basically have a little sort of tongue and groove thingy that fits together. So you can situate it. There we go. So you can just slide these things together and they'll pop in place. This one's really tight. I need to sand the edges down because this one will go in really easily. But basically it's an easy sort of thing to put together. And then you take a staple gun and you staple the canvas on. I'm not going to do a full demo of that because that alone takes 30, 45 minutes, but just so you know that that option's out there. And of course, you can find YouTube videos that show you how to do it. It's really pretty simple. And for me, it's one of the fun aspects of making art is just sort of making your own stuff to work Additionally, while I'm being like a technical geek, you can use oil grounds instead of acrylic grounds, and that makes a world of difference in the feel of painting. It actually is a smoother surface to work on, and it just feels nice to work on. And it doesn't absorb as much oil out of it. So I'll explain what this is. Again, I'm going fairly fast just because, you know, the time limitations. But with the acrylic ground, it's pretty absorbent of the oil that's in the paint. And so it tends to dry faster, and it's not quite as smooth to work on. With the oil ground, this is basically titanium white oil paint. And so you're painting on top of oil paint, basically, which is nice and smooth. But you have to put down a PVA size, which is basically a form of glue on the canvas first, and that solidifies it and keeps this oil ground from sinking in. So you don't really need to know that, but if you like to get specialized with it, it's a really makes a nice painting surface. All right, so some additional logistics is just easel recommendation. So I'm lucky. There's the Dick Blick in nearby in Galesburg, and you can buy stuff really cheap in the back. So this easel is a really expensive, several like $1,200 easel, probably is what it cost originally, but I got it for a lot cheaper. And it cranks up and down, you know, so it's really convenient. But that's, you know, that's a really expensive option. Some really inexpensive options. And very portable. This folds down like a camera tripod. You just pop these things and put that in place, and this just pops out, and then you put your canvas here, and then this goes up and down. So this is a really good. These run about $45 to $65, something like that, and they fold down really nicely. You know, and you can. So the whole thing is only about this long. They usually come with a little carry bag, so if you like to paint outdoors, this is a pretty good option. And like I said, this workshop is really for people who haven't painted before and are looking to set up really inexpensively and not have a huge mess to deal with. This is a pretty good option. And then if you're really interested in painting outdoors or painting really portable, this is great. This is called a Gorilla painting box. And just pop this open. So you can set this on a tabletop surface to work on, and it has a built-in palette. So basically this functions as where you put your paint here and here, and then brushes, you can pop them in here so it can hold your wet brushes out of the way. And then your canvas actually slides into here. And so this functions as where your paint goes, where your actual painting you're working on goes. And this is very adjustable, so you can sort of set it up to where you like it. And then there's room inside for a jar for your mineral spirits, and always stick mine in a plastic bag for extra security so it doesn't leak everywhere. And then room for your paint. So it's really a useful tool for if you're just trying to work in a corner of a room, or you just want to turn your dining room into a painting studio. This holds just about everything you need, and it's great for outdoors. They're actually made for painters who go outdoors. So there's a nice little carry handle, and here is what makes it really great. This is the screw thread for a camera tripod thing. So you can pop this, screw that in place. And I'm not going to take the time to do this, but when you're done, you pop it onto the tripod and have your tripod fully set up. And then you can work outdoors with this. And the tripod's really adjustable, so you can set it up how you like. And so this is these are pricey little boxes though. They're not that cheap, but they're really good for having a very portable thing. I like to paint when I travel, like when I visit my parents down in Alabama. I like to bring this along because then I can set up in the corner of a room and get plenty of painting done. All right, so that's it for easels and such. So Yeah, good. So I've got about, looks like I've got close to 10 minutes left, something like that, to talk to you about paint. And again, 35 minutes is a pretty tight time frame. So bear with me as I continue to speed talk. um, First off, this early is just to talk about painting in oils, but you might question whether or not you even want to bother with oil paint. So acrylic paint saves you the trouble of cleaning up with solvents and things like that. You just use water. Borrow this. Actually, I'll let you take it over there. If you just go point at this acrylic stuff. So these are basically the supplies you need for acrylic paint here. So a handful of colors and a few simple brushes, a spray bottle. I recommend using a medium to paint with acrylic, not full, not 100% of the time, but in terms of like you can thin it with water, but you can also use a medium, and that really opens up some possibilities. But you really don't need much, and then just a little jar for water, and everything cleans up with water. It's super easy. This here is a small painting I made just sitting at my parents' house last Christmas, not this Christmas, the one before, just sitting at the dining room table with very minimal supplies. I just had a few colors of acrylic paint. And anyway, there's a little hippopotamus toy and coffee cup and stuff. And that's done with acrylic paint. It was very quick to do and a lot of fun. So you can do a lot of detail with acrylic. I mean, you can pretty much do anything you can do with oil, you can do with acrylic. Personally, I enjoy oil paint more because it gives me more time to work in terms of just the slow drying time of oil paint. And so, that way that'd be good. Anyway, so the slow drying times are something I really enjoy. So I'm going to switch to talking about that now. But again, consider acrylic paint. You might pick up a small set of that first just to see how you like it. But it is really easy. Oil paint's a little bit more technical. There's a little bit more stuff you need to know about it. But you'll need some sort of a palette. And so palettes, traditional painters will use something like this, and they hold a few brushes in hand, and they've got their paint all spread out here. And that's what I used to do when I first started painting, because that's what my painting teacher taught me. And they come in a little smaller sizes too. But really what I find to be the most useful is just a permanent work surface. This is a piece of glass that came out of a picture frame that I've just taped the edges and taped down to my work surface. And so that works great for me. I like it a lot, and I don't have to hold it. And so, so it's really your choice how you want to work, but this is really how I like doing it. All right, so in terms of colors of paint to use, that's really what I want to talk a lot about today. So anyway, so in terms of paints, this is what I have my students use. I buy the really big tubes and I set them out for them to use, and they share them. And this is the only colors that I give them. And so these tubes are each around $2.99 to $3, $3.50 range each. Most of them anyway. And they're really inexpensive. They're student grade paints, but there's nothing wrong with them. They're actually quite good. Yeah, so if you're watching the YouTube video this later, you can just pause it on that if you want to buy those colors. And so this is probably the least expensive route in terms of getting started with oil paint, is to use these. Now the color choices here are specifically chosen to give you a maximum range for mixing. So you notice there's no brown here, there's no grays. Really, it's just a set of primary colors for the most part, and a couple, just one secondary color. And what I'm using is a warm and a cool version of reds and blues to get maximum color mixing. And so, so anyway, trying to think where to go next on this talk, because close to out of time. So I'm not going to do any actual color mixing for you, but there's an exercise. So what you should do first, probably, if you're just starting to paint, would be to just do a simple sort of smear colors around and see what colors come out of it. You could do a really informal version like this, where you just take and start spreading color around and see what you get. I think this is a phthalo blue, cadmium red, and yellow, basically just blended together to see what mixtures I get out of that. And so you could try just, you know, being very informal with it and just see what you get. Or you can get much more formal with it, like this. And this is a color wheel exercise I have my painting students do, and they're only allowed to use 3 colors. So they use cadmium lemon here, and they use, it's a color called permanent rose. It's also called quinacridone red and other brands. And they use this color, which hasn't been put in yet, but it would go about here. And then they use ultramarine blue. And so that color sits about there. And that's the only 3 colors they can use, is a red, a yellow, and a blue. And then they mix everything else. And because the choice of blue and red can come together to make a really good purple. So this purple is actually mixed up out of just this blue and this red. And to get a more brick red color, you just add more yellow into that particular red. And so, so real quick, I just want to do a little bit of color mixing just to show you what I mean. So another useful tool you should have around in your studio is a pair of pliers. Because if you haven't painted in a while, sometimes you need the pliers to open up the tubes. Not the case for these, because these are pretty fresh. But so I just wanted to show you in terms of mixing color. I'm just putting this directly on some canvas paper. And just the importance of these particular colors in terms of getting to a mixture that you need. So I'm going to use my ultramarine blue. Just throw some white out here. All right, so using a palette knife to mix with, if I want to make a purple, everybody knows that red and blue makes purple, right? And so I could take this blue here and mix it with this red. So I should get a purple, because red and blue make purple. Like every 2nd and 3rd grader knows that, right? Probably kindergartners know that. But you can see pretty much what I got is brown, right? So, so it didn't actually make a purple. So does that mean all those kindergartners are wrong? It's actually really just the shade of red you're using. So that's the importance of having multiple ones. So if I take this red and blue and mix these 2 together, this is the quinacridone red, or permanent rose is the sort of, what they call it in this brand. Right now it looks black, right? And that's one of the reasons why our teachers will often say you don't need black, because it's so easy to make black, because usually just a couple of colors or 3 colors together will make a black. But it looks black right now. But if I add some white to it, it's now turned into a pretty vibrant purple. You know, I've added a little bit too much white, so now it's kind of a more pastel sort of shade of purple. But that's a purple mixed out of, so that's a color mixed out of red and blue, but we got brown. And then this is a color made out of red and blue, but we got purple. And so that's why we have 2 reds here, because, you know, if I want to make, you know, a good orange, it would be easier to start with this very reddish, you know, this very orangish red, this cadmium red color. You just get there a little bit faster, right? And, you know, and so this particular exercise that I recommend doing is to take and use this is a worksheet I give my students to use, and there's just, they basically just take and make yellow, yellow, orange, orange, red, or red, purple, and all the way around the color wheel, and then have a mix directly across the color wheel. So they take yellow, so there's, here's the yellow side of the color wheel, and here's the purple side of the color wheel, and then they take a little bit of yellow and put it in the purple, and see what they get. And basically it dulls it down, it grays it down. And on this side, it's just a touch of purple in the yellow. And you get what basically looks almost like yellow ochre. And here you get what looks like raw sienna color. And so it's you actually get a nice shades of brown. And so that's one of the reasons why I recommend when you start out that you don't even bother with those colors, because you can buy colors like burnt sienna. Like this is a burnt sienna from Blocks. It's a really nice brand. And straight out of the tube, that's brown. We grab some white here. And you can see that that makes a really nice sort of shade of brown when you pull that out. Or yellow ochre. And so that's a nice sort of yellowish brown. And you can buy those colors, and I've done entire paintings using only earth colors. There was a time when I was in grad school when I was really interested in old master painting, like Rembrandt and Da Vinci and artists like that. And they really only had access to these earth colors. They call earth colors because they're mined from the earth. They're like red ochres and iron oxides and things like that. And so, as you can see, this color that came straight out of the tube, this yellow ochre color, it's pretty much about the same as this color right here. You know, and we mixed this up with just a cheap yellow and a cheap purple, right? We didn't have to have the extra. And then this burnt sienna color, it kind of sits down here and almost looks a little bit like that. I could add a little bit of blue probably to that color to get it to match more accurately. And so, and the reason I'm talking about this is because when you go to the art supply store, or go online to shop for colors, there's like 200 art colors, 200 different variations of color in oil paint. And so you're really hard pressed to know which ones to use. And so if you go back to that screenshot earlier of those colors, the phthalo blue, ultramarine blue, and all that, if you get those colors, you can pretty much mix up anything you need. And so by doing a color wheel like this, you can explore what you get. So this is the orange and blues mixed together, and you get kind of gross greenish looking browns in a way, but and then you can try red and green. And red and greens to me make some of the red and greens mixed together, make some of the best browns. They make really rich, fleshy colors of brown. So I think that's a really nice way to work. One more of these, for example, some of these colors are really expensive, like cerulean blue is a series 4 color. And the higher the number, the more expensive the paint. And so, I was tempted to try this out. It's very expensive paint. A little tube of this can run you 40, 50 bucks, sometimes even more expensive. But I found, and this is this is this color on this canvas paper. So there it is mixed with some white. But I found that just this simple phthalo blue plus some white and adding just a little bit of yellow to it pretty much got me in the same zone as that. And so this is like a $3 tube of paint versus a $30 tube of paint. So it basically saves you a lot of money to know where to start. So that's all I'm going to say about color. There's obviously tons and tons of colors. So this is, I have a lot of colors. Anyway, so this is just a shelf with like a whole bunch of different reds that I've tried out. And in my basement, I've probably got 100 more tubes of paint. Just because over the years I've tried out a lot of different things. And so, and I've just learned that just that basic, simple, small set of colors really gets you a long way toward, what you need for painting. And if you want to go even simpler, I would recommend just cadmium red, ultramarine blue, and cadmium yellow. So this is, I don't actually use the Witten colors myself, the student grade. I actually use Gamblin and Winsor & Newton and Utrecht. Those are some more artist grade colors. But I spent a whole summer painting, and the only colors I used was this red, this blue, this yellow, and this white. And you mix these two together plus a little bit of yellow, you get a deep dark black color. Just these two together, and you get a pretty good brown, like I showed you earlier. And so you can get pretty much everything you need. You don't get strong purples out of this palette. The Viridian Hue, this is a phthalo green color. It's basically the same as Grumbacher's phthalo green. That gives you a super vibrant green. So sometimes you want to add things. Dioxazine purple is a good one to add in because it gives you a really, really rich purple. But for starting out, that's a good set. The last couple things I need to tell you about is just how you get the paint onto the canvas. And so I have my students, and I've done entire paintings using only a palette knife. And so, so if you'll zoom in a little closer, Stephanie. The number 61 Blick and the number 44 Blick, those are my two favorites. We can see it better against the white background, but one is kind of skinny, and I like to use this to actually paint with, to actually use it to paint shapes and lines and edges with. And this is one I use more for mixing and also for painting with. So that's a good way to make paintings, and it's a really sort of chill, relaxed way to paint is just to only use the palette knife because cleanup's really easy. You just wipe the palette knife off when you're done. And then the other thing is brushes. So this is a travel box I use to bring brushes with me when I'm painting. So it's got my palette knife in it. And then basically you have two types of brushes. You have bristle brushes and what's called sable brushes. And for sables, I'll actually use a nylon sort of acrylic painting type brush. I like to use these. They don't actually make them anymore, this Hue Trick brand, but it's just a simple soft brush. And this is for detail and really smooth work. And so I like to have some brushes that are really good for small, fine detail. So you can see from the size of my finger and fingernail how small those are. And that's for when I'm painting on a painting like this, when I'm going in and trying to get like really fine, tight sort of eyelashes and details and so forth. And then for laying in a whole bunch of paint, you use what's called bristle brushes, which are natural hog bristle brushes. And those really throw in a lot of paint. And so I like to have a number 2 size round. I like to use these flat, wide number 8s and 6s. There's filberts shapes, which is shaped like a nut, like a sort of oval. And then there's flat shapes as well. So it's really your choice what you choose and use, but you can get by with just a handful. I tend to not get the ultra big brushes to paint with because if I've got a huge amount of paint to lay in, I typically will just load up my palette knife and then just throw in the background that way, right? Instead of, I don't like to get a brush that big dirty because it's a pain in the butt to clean it. So, and then I think the last thing I'm going to talk to you about is just how to clean up. So you could clean up with odorless mineral spirits. If you're going to use solvents to clean up, use odorless, use as safe as possible. So that can work. And then what you do is you put them in some sort of a jar. You want something that has a surface that you can rub your brush against. So they make these, and so you can rub the bristles against that. You basically fill it up with a solvent and then you put your brush in, clean it off, wipe it off with paper towels when you're done, then wash it off with soap and water, and then you're done. And they make really nice fancy tanks like this. This is courtesy of the cheap stuff in the back of Blick. And this is easy to clean. This is the thing you use to rub the bristles off with. And you can pull it out and clean the gunky residue out the bottom later. But this is the setup I like to use. So this is a real mess. But basically I take safflower oil, which is basically an ingredient in paint. If you look at your titanium white oil paint, often it'll have safflower oil in it. This is a really loose, almost watery oil. It's really almost like water. And I fill up one of those brush cleaning jars with oil up just so it covers the bristles of the brush. And then my brushes just go, I just prop them in there and I just leave them in there 100% of the time. They don't, like, not 100%, the rest of the time I'm painting with them. But basically, these sit here forever. I never clean them. So this to me is awesome. I learned this about 4 years ago, and I've never looked back. I tried it out. I thought it would ruin my brushes, to leave them sitting in oil all the time. But these have been sitting in there for ages, and they're just fine. The trick is, though, you need to paint fairly regularly for that to work. Like if you only paint once a month and do that, it might not work as well because some of the faster drying paints, because these oil pigments, some of them dry faster than others. And so, so it might actually not work so great. But if you paint at least twice a week, this is a great system. And then the advantage is you don't have to clean up because it is a huge pain in the butt to clean up your brushes. It just takes a while. It's a lot of fuss. And if you're only painting for an hour, setting your stuff up might take 15, 20 minutes to get all the paint out, get your brushes ready, and get ready to paint. And then it might take another 15 minutes to clean up, right? And then you're only left with 20, 25 minutes to paint, right? So if you're only going to paint for an hour, I'm much more likely to come in here and paint because all I got to do is come in and pull a couple of brushes out of the oil and just wipe it off on the side. And then I'm pretty much good to go. And this is nice and flexible. This has been sitting there. I haven't painted in about 3 days, and this is nice and flexible. It's not dried at all. And just to test this to the extreme, I left a few brushes I didn't care about in there for 3 months without doing anything, and they were fine. So I highly recommend the system. This is just a jar filled with oil. I like to have the coil in there, like I like to have this coil in there because I sometimes will want to clean a brush off, and so I'll get all these brushes out, and then I can then clean a brush off, wipe it off, and then use it. Also, you can use the system and after you wipe it off on the coil in the oil as much as possible and wipe it off as much as you can with your paper towel, you can go to the sink and with just soap and water, you can wash the rest of it out because the oil is pretty much broken down all the paint. No solvents needed. Your studio doesn't stink. It's not dangerous because mineral spirits can give you headaches and mess you up over time. So highly recommend that. Yeah, I think that's it. The last thing, kind of an important item, is a lidded trash can if you're going to use this system, because you're going to end up with oily rags. Now this has got a lot of oil on it. And if you're a mechanic, you know that mechanics worry about oily rags spontaneously combusting. And so actually, if you have a thoroughly oil soaked rag, I don't understand the physics of it. It's somehow, I won't even go into it. I've read about it, but it can actually catch fire, right? And so you don't want to risk it. So having a lidded trash can means it can't get oxygen. So if it did want to spontaneously combust, it would have no oxygen because there's a lid, right? And if you want to be even more professional, get like a professional fire safety can, you know, that has the lid on it. And I've never had them spontaneously combust on me, but it's something that you need to know so you don't catch your house on fire. So yeah, that's pretty much it. You know, I went over, sorry, but I couldn't help it. I tried. So we can switch back to seeing people's faces now if you guys want to. Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing now, so that's good.
Perfect. Let me invite everyone. So all of our attendees at this time, if you're interested in turning on your camera, you'll get a notification. It'll pop up asking if you want to become a panelist. If you select yes, then we'll be able to see your cameras. If you select no, that's okay. Now's the time to ask Professor Baugh any questions that you may have. If you're not comfortable being on camera and you do have questions, you can always add them in the chat and then I will read them off to Professor Baugh at that time.
Yeah, it'll be great to see you if you want to turn your camera on, but if your room's a mess, I understand. I had to clean my space up before doing this today.
Okay, I think everyone's been invited now. Perfect. All right, and Professor Baugh, if you switch to the gallery view, then you'll be able to see it as a traditional Zoom meeting at this time.
Yep. All right, I think I'm good. Sounds good. All right. Oh, I see Cherry Simmons is on here. Are you there, Cherry? Stephanie wants to show you the cat. I think she's going to bring the cat in. So we got our house cat from Cherry Simmons about 10 years ago, I think, something like that. And it's enormous now. All right, so I did kind of talk fast and I threw a lot of things out there. Generally, that's a first day of class thing I do for my painting class. And here's the cat. You won't hang around long. He's a scary cat. Hey, Pat. Like the beard.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, so in terms of, yeah, so that was kind of fast and not very good, but you know, it's trying to get a lot of information out there for you guys. And again, you can go back to the video and pause it, but I'm happy to answer questions. We have a useful resource in the audience though. Pat Messenger is a former student of mine and he works at Blick. And his job, if you want to put your number in the chat, do you still do that same job working at Blick doing the answering the phone?
Yeah, I do. And we're hiring positions. So if anyone needs a job, yeah, you can come work with me at Blick.
Yeah, so Pat's job is actually to answer questions about art supplies. So he works at Dig Blick, which is a huge professional art supply company. And he spends all day on the phone answering like, what color paint should I use? Or what brushes should I use? So if you want to put your professional work number in the chat, people can follow up and talk to you if they want to. They want to. So do you guys have any questions for me? Anything I can expand on? Do we have a time limit on this?
Nope.
I have a question.
Okay. Sure.
I'm not a very good artist. I'm a photographer, but I occasionally take some art classes here in New Jersey. And recently I've been taking them online and doing it out of my house. Have you ever used water-soluble oils?
Yeah, so the question is water-soluble oils. I have, and it's been a few years ago. It's probably been over a decade since I tried them. And my experience with them was one of the things that I really tested out was how the water works in terms of breaking it down. So normally water and oil don't really mix. They don't really work together very well. That's why you have to use a solvent. But they've somehow done some science so that you can break down the oil paint with water. It means you can clean up with water just like oil paints, and it means you can sort of loosen it up. I ended up not liking it because I was trying to treat it as if I was using it with a solvent like mineral spirits to paint with, and it was kind of a little bit gummy. But I imagine if you're painting without adding a lot of water to it, and probably there's really good mediums. One of the things I didn't talk about is adding things like Galkid Light or adding oils to the paint to loosen it up a little bit, because usually the paint, when it comes out of the tube, its consistency is somewhere between like mayonnaise and peanut butter, you know? And the mayonnaise is nice and soft and easy to spread with a brush. The peanut butter is a pain in the butt, you know, but you can always add some oil to it. Like you can just add like some cold pressed or sun thickened linseed oil to loosen it up. And so that for me was the issue, was just what do you loosen the water-based oil with? And they do have mediums. And so I imagine it works great. You know, I think the technology is really interesting and it makes cleanup really easy. So I would recommend that, even though I haven't tried it in about 10 years. You know,
Well, I
so.
live in an apartment and I just, you know, for the fumes and all that sort of stuff, I decided to use it instead of oil.
Exactly. Yeah, I think they're great. And
It's easier to clean up too.
yeah, and they're exactly the same. I don't know what they did to the oil itself at a microscopic level to make it so it breaks down in water, but there's really no difference. It still feels nice and juicy and oily like oil paint. So it's basically the same thing. So yeah, it's good stuff. I recommend using it.
And it's not as if I'm going to go in the Met anytime soon. So
Well, it's all about having fun with it. You know, it's something to do,
yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Do you ever? I think my camera's on, isn't it?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Do you ever like go over maybe like with your students, like laying foundation colors, like and building off of like a foundation color over the top of the gesso? Or do you ever find that to be needed in like oil? I do it a lot with acrylic. That's why I was curious about, and I only do a little bit of oil here and there, but.
Yeah, that's a really good thing. And that's the sort of short time limit. That's one of the things I glossed over, but let me grab something. This is a small painting of a coffee cup. And this is what my base layer would look like. So this, I'm basically, instead of thinning it down with mineral spirits, I'm just using a palette knife and just scraping it on. And so like, it's a really rough sort of layer. It's not very reflective. And then I'll paint on top of that, right? So yeah, working in layers is a really good way to work with paint, whether you're working in acrylic or oil paint. For one thing, one of the things I'm constantly telling my students is that your painting really has to be ugly before it looks pretty, you know? Like you can't get around it. It's gotta have this crude, rough, you know, halfway done. I'm looking around the room to see if I've got any more half finished things, but you know, it just has to be rough. And so one of the things you can do is you can combine acrylic with oil paint. So, and I've done this on many paintings in the past, is to start the painting off with acrylic, because I can thin that down with water, use mediums and stuff. And then after letting the painting dry, I can then work on top of that with oil paint. So, so that's a really good way to work. Oh, here's another one. This is sometimes I'll copy old master paintings. This is a copy of a Botticelli that I'm working on. It's in progress. And you can see the faces aren't in there yet. They're really roughed in, you know, they're just kind of blobs for eye sockets and so forth. And so that's an oil painting underpainting. But the thing to remember when you work with acrylic and oil on the same painting is you basically have a time period where you work in acrylic paint, and then you can't work in acrylic paint anymore. You stop and then you work only with oil. And the reason is if you take oil paint and put it on top of acrylic paint, it won't stick, you know? So even if the oil is dry, completely dried, it takes about 3 to 5 days for an oil painting to dry, first of all, depending how thick you put the paint on, and certain pigments dry faster than others. But if you try to paint acrylic paint on top of oil, it'll peel off. It just won't stick. So, so you can put oil on top of acrylic, but not the opposite, right? So that's a good way to combine it. It's a little bit faster too, because you don't have to wait around on layers to dry. And then like, I don't want to get too technical. There's a book called Ralph Meyer's Handbook for Painting. Stephanie, we see if it's in the closet there. It's a huge black book. It's a book I spent a lot of time with in graduate school. And it's basically written by art conservators who fix old paintings that fall apart, they crack and peel over time and everything. And it's basically all about how to make a structurally sound painting and all the rules to it. And if you really are concerned with that stuff, it's a really good way to, you know, to know what the rules are. And so one of the things I didn't get into is this idea of fat over lean, that when you paint an oil paint, you need to have fatter layers on top and leaner layers in the bottom, or otherwise it can crack and peel and everything. You don't really need to know that unless you're using a lot of layers. Like I like to work sometimes all in just one layer, like that painting of juggling balls I had earlier. That's done all in, don't worry about it. That's done all in one layer. And so I didn't have to really worry about layering. And so, but the fat over lean just means how much medium you're adding, how much oil you're adding to the paint. And so you want the bottom layer to be thin and you want that bottom layer to be lean. And so my version of that on this, I've kept the paint really thin by scraping it back with a palette knife. So it is nice and thin. And then I'll use thicker paint on top of it as I progress. And that's how that painting that's on the easel over here, that's how I did it too. I kept it kind of thin and then made it thicker as I went. So, yep. And I'm picky about that stuff because when I first started painting, I had paintings that actually cracked because I broke the rules because I didn't know the rules. And, you know, and you can also like break the rules on purpose on canvas paper, cheap canvas paper, just to see what works and what doesn't, you know. Have you tried that before, Pat? As part of your job, sort of see what works and what doesn't on purpose, try to fail?
I've talked to enough people that I know what works and doesn't work.
There you go. Yep. You guys have other questions I can answer?
We have a question in the chat. Someone would like for you to repeat the list of the 6 basic colors that you were using.
Okay, sure, yeah. So you want to have a nice bright cadmium yellow. This one's called cadmium lemon. I generally like to use the brightest cadmium yellow I can because I can make this more orangey by adding red to it, you know? Because if you use like cad yellow medium, it's kind of orangey yellow, but I like to have as pure bright yellow as I can get. So cadmium lemon. In the Winton brand, this is called quinacridone. I'm sorry, this is called permanent rose, but the pigment that's on it is called quinacridone red. So when I use Gamblin paint, this is actually called just straight up quinacridone red. So depending on what you're using, so that's the red. The other red is Cadmium Red Light. You could actually go with Cadmium Red Medium. This one's a little bit orangier. I like to kind of go with a sort of orangey red, either Cad Red Light or Cad Red Medium, just because that gets my sort of brick red colors. And when I add blue to this, it gives me kind of a nice rich brown. You know, as you saw earlier, it's so orangey that it's like orange and blue make a kind of a brown color. So for the blues, I like to use phthalo blue. That's a really interesting, intense blue. It's really mostly useful for abstract paintings or kind of eccentric colors within a still life painting. The more normal blue to use is ultramarine blue. So if you're only going to buy one, just get ultramarine blue. That works great. But yeah, phthalo blue, you guys can see that. And ultramarine blue, that's a great one. In this Winton brand, this color is called Viridian Hue, but it's also called phthalo green. So if you were to buy it in a brand like Gamblin, it would be called phthalo green. Spell funny, P-H-T-H-A-L-O. Those are basically the same pigment. They come out the same color. It's just a different sort of product name. So Viridian Hue or phthalo green.
Brian, I think it might be worth mentioning the difference, like what a hue color actually is.
Oh, sure, yeah.
What do we know?
I think I covered them all except titanium white. Did I miss any, guys? I think so. Titanium white's good. Yeah, so Pat brought up a good distinction, the hue colors versus real colors. And Pat, you might have noticed that I'm actually using the real cadmium version of the Winton, right? And the reason for that,
it's like one of the few brands that actually puts real cadmium in their student grade paint.
Yep, and that's why I chose this brand too, because I tried them all when I was trying to find cheap stuff for my students to use. So the difference is that some pigments are much more expensive than others, and cadmium is a doozy, like a tube of cadmium red or cadmium yellow. Those can run you in the professional grades about $30, you know, for a tube of cadmium red or cadmium yellow. Like this giant tube of cad red, when I was doing bigger paintings, I bought this huge tube. This might be a $60 tube of paint, whereas the same size tube in Hue, the Hue version might be 20 bucks or 15 bucks, something like that. So it's a big price difference. And so what they do is they offer hues where the company tries to mix up the color as close as they can get it from cheaper pigments. And usually the hue of cadmium yellow is, if you look at it, it'll say, instead of saying cadmium on it, it'll say cadmium hue. And then when you look at the ingredients, it will say like airlight yellow, I think is usually what they use. And the reason I hate that color is that it's transparent. Like when you try to paint with it, it's not opaque at all. It's like, but if you're a person who like glazing, which is using really thin layers of glaze, it's great as a glaze color. So actually airlight yellow is a really good color if you want that. So anyway, so that's the distinction. So that's really good that Pat brought that up. So when you buy these, it might be tempted to go, because this cadmium red that I showed you too in this Winton brand, the hue is cheaper. Like I think these run $3 for cadmium red hue and about $7 or $8 for cad red regular. Is that about right, Pat?
That's about in the ballpark, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not that much more, and it makes your painting experience a lot nicer. I don't really dislike the cad red hue as much as I do the cad yellow hue. It tends to be okay, but yeah, so, and that's why the other thing too is like student grade versus artist grade. So this is a tube of artist grade Winsor & Newton ultramarine blue, and this is Winsor & Newton student grade, which is called Winton, is sort of their code name for their student brand. And if you're doing like huge paintings, like Dusty, you do enormous paintings, you probably actually want to go with Winton, the massive tubes. It'll give you a good painting experience, and working big, you won't feel so self-conscious wasting money, right? But the difference with it is they put fillers in the paint to sort of make up. So this has the same pigment, ultramarine blue, it's the same pigment, but they put like some sort of inert aluminum filler thing in there in the cheaper stuff to sort of not to save, basically to save money on the pigment, because what's inside of here is dry powdered blue pigment, this ultramarine blue stuff, and oil. And so it's the amount of that pigment that they put in that makes it more or less expensive for them as a product, right? And so they use fillers to sort of, and the fillers can actually make the paint react a little bit differently and not mix as rich and pure colors. But I think it's what you get used to. Like there's a painter named Chase Langford who does like really good abstract paintings. I love his abstract paintings. And I've noticed on his painting table, it's all Winton. And he's a professional who sells each painting for about 40,000 bucks. And it's like, you know, it's just what you get used to, right? And so you can be snobbish about your paint or not. And so I think it's also size. Yep, what's that, Dusty?
Oh, I was just saying, just like to go with what you're saying, like it's funny because there's some things that I use that are of a higher expense, and then there's other things that if people realized what I was using would probably, you know, that are so dismissed by most because they're so inexpensive. But it's like, you know, just like what you said, it's like what you get used to, and I'm largely self-taught in a way, so much of mine's just been the trial and error process, you know, so some of those started out with very inexpensive things in the beginning that have just held the true through the test of time for me anyway. But
yeah, absolutely. And I think that for some people, I would actually recommend using the cheapest paint possible, because if you're trying to do really big paintings or abstract paintings, you have more freedom if you're not worried about how much it costs. Like if your red costs you 20 bucks for the tube, you're not going to use much red. That's why I have this huge tube, because with a really big tube of red, I'm more likely to slather on the red, you know? And so, but however, doing like really small portraits or these more detailed, realistic still lifes, I like to use my better paint on that, just because I'm not using much paint, first of all. So it's not costing that much money in paint. And then I don't know, I feel better about it somehow. I don't know, psychological, I guess. But the trick is to just buy the stuff and play with it, you know? And if you live in this area, you go to Galesburg and you go in the back room of Blick and you find like tubes of paint that are normally 10 bucks and they're $2, right? And so you can like try stuff all the time. That's how I ended up with like 100 tubes of paint, is because it's so cheap up there, you know? So you guys have other technical questions or anything painting related?
There's one comment and two questions in the chat right now. So Kurt, his comment was that he looked into odorless mineral spirits and noticed that there was a difference. Gamasol is expensive, but the safest that he knows of, and the spontaneous combustion temperature is a lot higher.
Yep.
And then Cheryl White asked two questions. Was it the safflower oil that you used to clean your brushes, and are the cadmiums dangerous to your health?
Yeah, that's another good point that I didn't mention. The one that I always talk to my students about is, all right, so I'll start with the safflower oil. That's the easier question to answer. So this is this is the safflower oil I use, and I go ahead, or I have the Utrecht brand around here somewhere. I use either Utrecht or the Gamblin brand of just pure safflower oil, and I use that to clean brushes with. And also I use this because it's really good to loosen the paint up with. Like if I want to use as a medium, I can add a little touch of it to the paint and it lets it flow a little bit better. You don't want to use this like it's a watercolor and add this so much to the paint that it's like running down the canvas. It'll turn really yellow on you and not really work very well. You have an option if you want to cheap out, go a little bit cheaper. You can buy safflower cooking oil and use it. I've not tested it to paint with in terms of adding safflower cooking oil to the paint to loosen it up and paint. I'm afraid it might not work well. I don't know what the difference is between the cooking version of safflower oil and the professional artist version. I should probably try it out and see, but if you do choose to use the cooking oil, only use it to clean your brushes with. Don't add it to the paint and paint with it because it might not work great, I use things like Sunthicke and linseed oil not to clean brushes with because it is kind of more like honey, where this is a bit more watery, so it cleans the brushes better. But this is what I'll add to paint to loosen it up a little bit so it's not too much like peanut butter, right? A real important consideration when you're painting is if you're trying to paint like Van Gogh or Monet and you want those thick, juicy, heavy brush strokes, you don't want to add anything to the paint. You want it straight out of the tube. You want it nice and thick. If you're trying to paint like Vermeer or an old master, actually they made their own paint. They didn't go to the store and buy it. They had assistants and they made their own paint with pigment and oil. And they were
Did he pause for anybody else?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, we'll wait a moment and see if he's able to reconnect.
okay.
There you are.
Okay, good. Was that me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm glad everybody's still here. Okay, excellent. So yeah, that gave me a little heart attack. All right, so where was I? We're talking about the oil stuff, right?
It's like Vermeer.
Oh yeah, painting like Vermeer. It depends on what you're trying to do with the paint. So if you're trying to do more realistic stuff, it's useful to just add a drop of oil or two to these little piles of paint and just go and mix it up with your palette knife. And then it just softens it up a lot. And actually, there's no harm in that because some of your paints actually come out of the tube looser than others. So like my ultramarine blue, it might come out really nice and soft and easy to paint with, whereas my titanium white paint might come out really thick and peanut buttery, And so I want to add a little bit of oil to that white just to loosen it up some so they match in consistency. And you can use, there are things like solvent-free gels, and there's a solvent-free liquid version of this you can add to your paint. But the viscosity of your paint is an important thing to modify because painting can be really annoying if you're trying to get a certain effect and it's just too thick or it's too watery or too runny or whatever. And so that's an important one to deal with. So the question about toxicity. So paint is really safe. Now, of course, everybody.
You lost him again.
I think so.
All right, good. You guys are still there. Sorry about that. I don't know why I'm dropping out, but I'll try to get this question answered. So, so paint is actually really safe to use as long as you follow just a few sort of basic, really basic safety precautions. Just be relatively clean when you do it. So this is only harmful. This cadmium oil is only harmful if I ingest it, if I get it inside of me, right? And the only ways I can get inside me is not breathing. You can't breathe this in, right? You can smell it. And actually one of my favorite things about oil paint is it smells really good, right? It's got this nice oily smell. When I was a little kid, I did paint by numbers, and they were oil. In the 70s, the paint by numbers were made with oil paint. It came with a little thing of linseed oil. And so it reminds me of being like a little 8-year-old, And so I have a real affection for how this stuff smells, but you can't really breathe it in. So it's not gonna get into you through breathing it because what you're smelling is the oil. Now, if you stuck this in an airbrush and sprayed it, yeah, it's airborne then. So it's not airborne. You don't have to worry about that. However, some people like to sand a canvas down after they've painted on it for a while, right? And so if you sand it, you're making the particles airborne and you can breathe it in. or if you're trying to reclaim an old canvas and sand it down and paint on it some more. So if you're doing any sanding, do it outside and do it with the mask on, and then wipe it off with a wet towel. And then, so that's the only way it can go airborne that I know of. Don't eat it, which means basically try not to get it all over your fingers. Some people, when they paint, if you want to get paint like all over your hands and you're using oil paint, put on some gloves, you know, put on some like nurse's gloves and paint away. I had a student who wanted to do a finger painting in class, and I just said use gloves, and it worked great. But you just, if you get it on your hands, you're gonna eat a sandwich. It's gonna get on the sandwich. You're gonna get it in your body, or you're gonna smoke a cigarette. You're gonna eat it on the cigarette and it gets in your body. So basically, just keep your hands clean. Keep it out of your mouth. Don't eat it. Some people claim that Vincent van Gogh ended up with mental health problems because of lead poisoning. I don't know if that's true or not, but because he would do things like eat the paint. It's in like Van Gogh's letters, like, I don't know. And he would like point a brush, like by putting it in his mouth to like make it pointy, and you would get, you know, poisoning that way. So cobalt blue, if you use cobalt blue, that's a heavy metal, so you have to be careful with that. You can actually eliminate any of the heavy metals from your palette. You can use the hue-based paints, like Naphthol Red's a good replacement for Cadmium Red. You try some of the other ones and not use any of those at all if you're worried about it. So I think that's really the only toxicity to worry about. And then there's the thing with mineral spirits I talked about earlier. If you do choose, one of the things that you give up if you don't use solvents, one of the most awesome painting experiences is when you've got a jar of mineral spirits and you dip your brush in that and you dip it in the paint, and then you paint on their painting and it just flows nicely, almost like a watercolor, you know? And there's no way to do that if you're not using mineral spirits or turpentine. You just lose that experience. And that's where the water-based paints might come into play. The water soluble oils might come into play that you mentioned earlier, but you give that up, you know, if you're not using mineral spirits. So if you've got a garage to paint in, or a room that's not like, you know, attached, you know, not in your house, I would recommend using solvents. You use the mineral spirits because it's just a lot more fun. It gives you a whole nother step. There's like steps you can use where you let the paint drip down the canvas like Jackson Pollock or something, and it just looks great, you know. But I gave that up so I could paint in a room in my house and not have to worry about. And how do you ventilate your studio anyway? Because you can deal with the solvents by ventilating your studio by opening a window. When it's negative 12 degrees outside in Monmouth, you know, who wants to open their windows up, right? But yeah, that's really the only health problems with it. It's really pretty safe stuff, you know. How do you dispose? I see another question there. You want to read that one to me?
How do you dispose of mineral spirits or turpentine?
That's a good question too. So I don't use them myself anymore. And at school, we used to use them, but then I phased that out and went with this clean up with the whole thing. We had a student who was really hypersensitive to stuff and couldn't even come in our building because of the ceramics kiln and all the dust and the mineral spirits and everything. And so I decided to be nice and sort of phase that stuff out. But before, I used to deal with getting rid of a ton of mineral spirits because my students just crank through that stuff. And so the system there, you can recycle the mineral spirits that you're using. So basically, if you've got, let's say you've got a jar that's full of mineral spirits that's been used up. What happens when you clean off your brushes is it sits in suspension for a little while in this, what used to be clear mineral spirits. And then the pigments settle down to the bottom, right? And if you don't paint for a week, it goes clear again. And then you see this like sort of nasty brownish gray sort of pile of pigments at the bottom. And the longer you paint, the more that pile of pigments build up. If you paint for a couple of years and paint regularly, it'll get like this thick. And that'll be just solid pigment. And from here up is mineral spirits. And so basically at some point, you'll notice that your mineral spirits isn't clearing anymore and you'll want to replace it. And then what I end up doing is I'll just take and pour off the mineral spirits that's clean and not too cloudy into another jar to use. And so I might have a second one of these jars that I pour it off into. And then this is where it gets messy. You put on some big old dishwashing gloves, and then you take a screwdriver and I poke it into here. This is basically a spring inside of there, and I poke a screwdriver inside of that spring, and then I face it away from me into a sink that I don't mind getting really dirty. Like the sink in our painting room is really dirty. So I take, and then I pry that out and pop it out, and then it sprays paint everywhere because it's a spring. So I'll pull that out, I clean this coil off as well as I can, and then I take a painting knife, scoop, what do you call it? Almost like a spatula sort of thing, for doing wallboard, whatever you call that. Anyway, I'll take that and I scoop out the gunk put that, into a plastic bag, get all the gunk scraped out, wipe it out with a paper towel. And then it's nice and clean to use again. And then I can pour the mineral spirits that I poured off of this back in there. And then I pour some fresh mineral spirits back in there, and then it's good to go again. And then you're not actually throwing the mineral spirits away. You just have that sort of nasty clogged up pigment stuff. And then for that, it's best to treat that like hazardous waste, because it's got heavy metals and things like that in it. And so luckily at school, I can just give them a bag of that stuff. And then because it's a chemistry department, they have someone who deals with that stuff. Dealing with that on your own, probably the most, without throwing it in the trash. It's your call if you throw it in the trash or not. I'm not gonna make a judgment on that. But Gamblin, the company that makes paint, they actually make paint out of like leftover dust that they collect from the filtration system. And it makes it gray, right? So you can take that lumpy stuff, maybe add a little bit of oil, squish, and mix it up into paint. I don't know if that will work well or not, but yeah, so I went a little long in that answer, but basically you never really have to deal with throwing the mineral spirits itself away because it just recycles, So see another question down there, if you want to read that one out to me.
It's a comment from Kurt. He does not recommend using turpentine, that you can observe that turpentine through your skin and get chemical hepatitis.
Oh, so that's a good point. And I don't actually know anything about turpentine because I've never used it. I've been in studios where other people were using it, and all I know is it smells worse than anything else in the room. Yeah. Some people like the smell, but yeah, I think it's a much more toxic thing. So if you want to learn a lot about technical stuff, go to Gamblin's website, and they have a whole lot of newsletters on how to safety in the studio. So if you go to their safety in the studio section, it'll recommend cleaning with oil, like I've talked about. It'll also recommend using Gamsol, which is a really nice odorless mineral spirits. If you go to the hardware store and just get the cheap mineral spirits that you would use for cleaning up, in the shop, it's going to have a smell. And somehow there's a process for making this where they remove the volatile compounds that get in the air. So it's actually worth the extra money. Sometimes things are rip off at the art supply store, like something you could buy at the hardware store, like a toolbox to put your brushes and stuff in. You might pay 3 times as much at an art supply store just for the markup, so. I saw another comment or something down there, if you want to read that out to me.
Yeah, Cheryl said that she used baby oil in her printmaking studio in Santa Fe.
Oh, nice. Yeah, so that's another option. Stephanie took a lot of printmaking classes, and that's one of the things that she's experienced before is using baby oil. Do you still do that?
I just use cooking oil, but we're solvent-free studios.
Right, yeah. So baby oil could definitely work. But yeah, the reason I do choose the safflower oil is simply because, like, let me see this white. Yeah, the back of this tube of white that I'm using to paint with, it actually on the back is the list of ingredients. I don't know if you can read it or not, but it says safflower oil under what's in it. So basically when you use the safflower oil, you don't have to worry about the bits that are left over in your brush in terms of it getting in the paint. But you could also have like a separate jar of that and use it to clean up. But what I found is, like, after I clean out as much as I can off the brushes, if I just take a bar of ivory soap and then just run water over it and just run it into that bar of soap and just have a bar of soap that's just for that. And then when I'm done, sort of pinch the bristles out, and then I actually leave a little bit of soap in the bristles to shape it, and then just set that aside to use for next time. But again, now that I switched to this old technique, I never clean them. So it's like, don't have to worry with that. Some other questions, technical or otherwise?
Brian,
a nice setup there. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Dustin.
No, that's all right. I actually got to be going, but I just wanted to say real quick to sympathize. I had a shoulder injury that lasted for about 2 years. But the good news is I finally fully recovered. But I don't know quite what yours is, and of course, there's several different kinds of shoulder injuries. But if you're ever interested in there was a couple things that I found later on after going through therapy and everything else, but feel free to reach out or connect or whatever, and I'd be happy to share my experience.
Yeah, I might set up a time, so email you and set up a time to talk with you, because it's basically they diagnosed as inflammation, so there was no surgery needed, but I don't know, they might have misdiagnosed, because I did physical therapy, I did it all, and it's just like not so good. So yeah, thanks for the offer.
Yeah, I did all that. Turns out I was really under treating it because I don't like taking a lot of medication. But anyway, we can talk about that later. So
yeah, thanks. I'd like to hear, because Yeah, that's hopeful that you got over it after a couple of years.
Yeah.
It's a pain in
Yeah.
the butt.
So, well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You have to
Yeah,
go.
thanks, Dustin.
Thank you, Brian. That was great. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. Good to see you. Bye.
Before we wrap up, and just so I've got it on the recording for those who watch later on, Patrick did send us over the phone number for Dick Blick for their product information. So if anybody wants to reach out to them, it's 1-800-933-2542. And that's the second number that you sent us, Patrick. So that's the correct one, correct?
Yeah, correct
Great.
number.
Perfect.
Repeat that, please. I'm sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. 1-800-933-2542.
Great. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Are
Good-
there any
good
other
presentation.
questions? No? All right. Well, then I just want to say thank you to everyone. The Office of Alumni Engagement is currently in the process of planning our virtual events for the spring. We have a few great ones lined up that are coming up here soon. So on January 28th, you can join us for Alumni Team Trivia that will be hosted by Vanessa Wetterling, who from class of 96. And then we also have a presentation on Black History and Black Baseball on February 2nd. That will be hosted by Raymond Doswell from class of 91. You can see a complete lineup of what we're working on our website, and you can also register there as well. As a reminder, as you leave the webinar tonight, you will see a survey pop up on your screen. We'd love for you to just give us some of your feedback and give us some ideas for future events as well. Many thanks to Professor Baugh and Stephanie, you as well. Thank you for joining and assisting today. And then thank you again to all of our attendees for taking just time out of your week to join us tonight. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your week and please stay safe.
Thanks again. It's good seeing you all.
Thank you.